All right, everybody. Thanks so much for joining us today on our first Dev Careers AMA. We've got Matt Garrier joining us. We've got Ross Kaffenberger, as well as Brandon Kessler. And I'm Neil, and Richard's off in the distance somewhere, sort of keeping track of us and making sure our video works well. So we have a bunch of questions today that we thought we would ask our illustrious heads of engineering, and please feel free to ask some additional questions yourself using the little question module on the right sidebar, and we'll be sure to drop those in as well. So let's sort of get started. Maybe you guys can introduce yourselves and let us know how you got here.
Sure, I'll go first since I'm right next to you. I started here at Devpost about 1.5 years ago now. I started as a senior software engineer, and now I'm transitioning to be the head of engineering. So, that's my story.
My name is Ross Kaffenberger. I am former head of engineering here at Devpost. I've been here for 4.5 years, and I've had a chance to both grow as a developer and mentor other developers along the way, and it's been a fantastic experience.
And I'm Brandon. I'm founder and CEO of Devpost.
Cool. So for pretty much all of you, this is not really your first go around, either in a startup or a dev job. So tell us a little bit how you found your first development gig.
Sure. So I got it through my college's careers email list. There was, every day they would send out jobs, people that were looking for developers, and I saw a local company right down the street that was looking for a Ruby on Rails developer. So it was sort of like win-win, right? Because it was right down the street. I could just sort of walk there, ride a bike, and it was also a good opportunity for me to learn Ruby on Rails. So I started there as a summer intern during my junior to senior summer. And then I started working part-time after that during the last semester at school, and then I became full-time right after that. So it's pretty sort of fell into it, right? I got my internship, and then I got my part-time job, and then I got my full-time job there. So not too much crazy job searching or anything. It's just sort of started and worked my way up the ladder there.
Cool.
Well, my path was much different. So my first job out of school, I was a school teacher. I joined the Teach for America program, and I had no background in programming or coding in college or previous, maybe just some logo programs in elementary school. But I had an aptitude for things that were technical, and I was interested in it. I would build, web pages now and then, just HTML, CSS. At some point, though, I got really excited about it. I joined a tech firm here in the city, not as a coder, but as a product developer, someone who worked on the other side, so to speak. And as I got more and more involved with the technical team, I wanted to learn more. I had this curiosity. So eventually, I convinced my employers to let me help out on the dev side. So I learned a little bit on the job. I actually transitioned at my current company into my first development role, but I didn't necessarily feel like I had all the skills necessary to just be a full-time developer. I had to pick up a lot along the way. And I was fortunate, though, to transition into a consultancy role after that. I got my first job outside of that context at a consultancy firm, and it was actually Cyrus Innovation here in the city. And it was a fantastic way for me to learn the traits of being an agile web developer. This was also in the days before coding bootcamp. So I feel like developers switching careers like I did at this point have a lot of resources available online or through these bootcamps and a lot of support. But that said, I was able to build myself up into a fairly competent developer very quickly with support from other developers at this consultancy. I got that job through Craigslist, if you can believe that. That was about as helpful as a job search engine as we had in those days.
What year?
This was roughly 2006. So the fact that teams like Devpost are trying to solve this problem for developers now, I can only imagine how much better the job search experience would be especially for junior developers looking for that first gig.
Cool. And Brandon, you've got a little bit of a different path that might have led you here. You want to share some of that?
I'm just one of those people. I'm only happy professionally when I'm starting companies and helping build companies. Otherwise, I'm a miserable wreck, and you won't want to be around me. So that's just what I love to do. And frankly, when we look for developers, we look for people that really want to be doing what they're doing. So I think that's an important takeaway.
Cool. All right, we got a question from Estella, which is, what's your biggest challenge that you've had in your career, and how did you handle it? It's a good question.
That's a good question.
Wants to tackle
Yeah,
that
so
one?
There's probably a mix between maybe technical challenges that have been hard and then non-technical challenges like dealing with business or people or that kind of thing. I guess I'd say, do you want me to filter by the day, week, month, year, or all time?
Well, I think those are good parameters, Brandon. I can think of a big technical challenge that comes to mind just within this past year, although as Brandon hinted at, it's really hard to pick the biggest one. I think there are a number of challenges that cross disciplines. But Devpost used to have a different brand, and earlier this past year, we transitioned from our old brand into what we are now, and that involved a lot of moving parts. You might think it's just as simple as changing the domain name and making sure things redirect and maybe reskinning the website, but for us, having had a website running for many years, there were a lot of assumptions made under the covers, so to speak, that we had to address before we could even think about making that change. I had to involve almost every member of the team, including marketing, product development, other developers, the CEO, in helping to make this transition. So coordinating that effort, everyone was very excited about it, but it did mean having to think through so many different ifs and whats and trying to anticipate it, because as the head of the team, it was my responsibility to make sure that switch happened in an instant or as close to it, and we could go to the site and proceed as business as usual, because our users depend on us and expect the service to be running at all times. So that kept me up at night. We actually got up very early in the morning to pull that off, around 5 in the morning on a summer day last year. And thankfully, everything turned out very well. But that was a coordinated team effort that took close to 2 months of planning from when we said we're doing this to when we pulled the switch. So one of the great accomplishments of my career by far, but it was not possible without the participation and support and help from the rest of my team.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of my biggest challenges, probably it wasn't a huge challenge to anyone else, but I'd been working on Ruby on Rails at college, and when I got my first position, I was handed a PHP project that had been outsourced overseas. So it was, it was a language that I'd never used before, and all of this was way before Laravel and all these sort of PHP MVC frameworks. So it was all just procedural PHP written at the top of these HTML files. No classes, no testing, live editing on the production servers. You just SSH in or you FTP your files right up to production, and they're just immediately live, right? So there were so many different aspects of it, like learning PHP, trying to make this code sort of object-oriented because no one could work with it because it was just all procedural, nothing. Trying to get tests set up, trying to use an object relational mapper because these were just all arrays of arrays from the database. Trying to get the outsourced team to use version control. So like a lot of the things that you take for granted when you join a team as sort of already being there,
Yeah.
like you sort of already have an ORM, you have a test framework, you're using version control. Usually you know the language a little bit, so
it's like your worst nightmare, basically.
yeah, pretty much. No one taught us that in school, how to recover a project that was over budget, over the deadline.
Yeah.
That no one really put a lot of love into.
So did you just label everything like version 1, version 2, index.php, version 8?
There was a lot of that until we got everything in source control, and we used Red Bean. I don't know if that's still a popular ORM for PHP, but we got that into place, and we started running classes, which is a big surprise for that project, but we got it under control.
Yeah, and I think for me that the hardest things I think of running a startup have to do with there being catch-22s. So how do you raise money if you have no product? How do you build a product if you have no money? How do you hire a team or hire developers if you don't have money? And how do you get money if you have no developers? I think the answers to both of those are build something and do all you can to get traction, at least some amount of traction that then allows you to attract financing and then people to your team. How do you build a cool product if there's nobody yet that's actually using it? And how do you get people to use your product if it's not cool yet, which no product is when you first launch? You know, how much do you listen to your customers, which is what you need to do in order to succeed? But how much do you say no to customers? Because if you do everything the customers tell you, then you know you're not going to really stay focused and be able to sort of maintain the vision and the mission of the company. So I'd say for me, the hardest things have to do with that catch-22, where both sides you have to do a little bit of, and sort of figuring out that balance is something that comes with time.
Cool. All right, so let's move on to some more careers questions. So this is one that I think we hear a lot, which is what differentiates a junior developer from a senior developer, right? Like, what does that mean?
Right. So, I mean, I think that I'm going to give an answer that's different than the typical, like, number of years of experience or number of languages that you know, things like that. To me, the things that sort of separate a junior developer from a senior developer is sort of how much you think about the code you're writing and how much you learn from the lessons that you've, you know, the projects that you've had in the past, things like that, right? Because you can be someone that's been working in the field for 20 years, but you've been the same developer for 20 years, right? Like, a senior developer is someone that learns from their past and they grow as a developer, right? Like, I don't think it's any number of years where you say after 5 years you're a senior developer, right? Because that could be 5 years of the same experience. So it needs to be someone that shows sort of traction and growth over time and takes, you know, steps back and introspects and asks themselves, like, is this the best way I could have written this code, or is there some design pattern that could help me, things like that. So that's how I look at a senior developer, someone that goes above just writing the code, that they actually sort of like think about the code, if that makes sense.
I think this is a really good question. I mean, there's no you know, well-recognized handbook for how to be a senior engineer. I can recommend a couple resources that came to mind. There's an author and engineer named David Copeland who wrote a book, something around the title of Being a Senior Software Engineer. And there's a great article that made the rounds maybe a couple years ago on kitchensoap.com about being a senior engineer. Of course, there's probably a ton of other great resources. Those are a couple that came to mind. I think maybe boiling down some takeaways from, you know, those resources and what I've learned. You know, actually, it's worth pointing out there's a lot in common that good junior developers and good senior developers have. Things like a passion for their work and curiosity and being able to work well with their teammates. Some things that might differentiate a senior engineer, though, aside from the fact that they will have more experience just by having spent more time with the given technology. Let's take it as a given that they will be expected to know their language or whatever framework they have, or be able to get up to speed, you know, typically much faster than a junior engineer. I think a couple traits really stand out. One generally is awareness. And I think you can break that down in a lot of ways. So there's an awareness that senior developers have that they will often need to make trade-offs. And they will make those trade-offs explicit. So for example, you might decide to implement a new feature in a certain way, but you recognize that there are other ways that you could have done it that would serve perhaps different needs. Like you could have spent more time to make it optimized, but that also means not getting it out the door as quickly. There's also an awareness of how your decisions impact other members of the team, and that sort of gets back to what I was saying about being able to work well with others. I mean, no one wants to work with an asshole, right? So I think there's an aspect of being empathetic and having the ability to make decisions that take into account and respect other people's opinions on the team. And that gets into my sort of second trait, and that's judgment. So I believe that senior engineers, based on experience and also a willingness to be humble about what they are deciding to do, is certainly a trait that stands out to me as well. But I definitely recommend those resources I mentioned to go into a lot more detail and break down those subjects. But I think mostly you can characterize what I said about traits that are not necessarily related to technical ability. It's much more about maturity.
Exactly. There's not much difference in my view between a senior engineer. What makes a great senior engineer and what makes a great senior marketer or senior salesperson or senior product manager. It's less about the actual discipline, and as Ross said, more about what type of person you are. Are you thinking strategically about the business? Are you trying to always make the company better and your team better? Are you working hard and setting a good example for the people underneath you? And I think maybe one takeaway for the junior developers, or maybe soon to be junior developers out there, is I think you can think about your job in two ways. One is the day-to-day. So the stories or tasks or cards that you're given that you're going to want to do and have it be good quality and be productive and that sort of thing. But the second, which I think aligns more with what it means to be a leader, is to be asking yourself, how does my work align with the company's goals? Like, what's the mission of the company? What's the main metrics the company's trying to drive? And how can I, in my role, help affect those? And that could be trying something new. That could be trying something, A/B testing some new process that you haven't worked on or that you haven't done before. And just thinking strategically about the success of the business. That there's really you don't need to wait to do that stuff. And I think that's the kind of stuff that makes somebody senior more than you.
I was stuck in that book recommendation, The Senior Software Engineer. I read that within like a couple days. So right after you sent it to me, I started devouring it on the train on the way to and from work every day. It's a very good book.
Cool. Now, a common component of, I think, a lot of job applications, and you see it asked for a lot, is, like send me your GitHub. Like, show me all your code. That's open source. Is that valuable? Do you guys actually review that when you look at a candidate? Or, and if you do, is there something in particular you're looking for?
I would say for many developers, it's very difficult for them to do their work in the open. I think so. I have to be careful when I think about someone's GitHub contributions. I do consider it to be a plus when I can see a lot of evidence of activity and I can see examples of their work and how they interact with other developers. But I also do my best not to hold it against candidates when those contributions are not as visible, because it's potentially not as feasible for all of us to do our work out in the open. And I believe that GitHub can be a plus, but it shouldn't be held against someone for not having done a lot of that work out there. So I don't necessarily see it as a if-or kind of use case.
I think one of the things that I look for most in a GitHub account, assuming like Ross says that they have a lot of things on there, is whether or not they sort of like show progress over time, right? Because sometimes when you view, some GitHub repos are just sort of like a bunch of one-off tutorials that you did and that's sort of it. Like whether or not you actually sort of built these projects and maintained them and went above and beyond, that sort of thing, as opposed to just like you created this Git repo because that was like the first line in the tutorial and you did your initial commit and then that was it, So that's sort of what I'm looking for when they actually have stuff on there, is sort of whether or not they kept working on it or whether or not they did something different from the common tutorials like the Michael Hartle's Ruby on Rails tutorial, things like that. So things that sort of differentiate them from just someone that just did a bunch of exercises and wasn't actually sort of continuing to work on things.
Cool. All right, let's take another question from the line. So if you had to choose between a candidate more technically experienced versus one that is less technical experienced but better community and soft skills, which would you pick and why?
It's a tough one.
Well, it's a tough question.
Depends, right?
It really depends.
It always depends.
I think, it's very difficult to consider this question in a vacuum. I think there are potentially going to be a lot of good reasons to pick somebody, and it doesn't necessarily just rely on technical experience and soft skills or one or the other. I think maybe one hidden suggestion in this question would be potential. So we have definitely hired people that have not necessarily had a lot of experience with our choice of technologies, but we've judged or done our best to anticipate that person's potential. And so I think a good way of thinking about this would be we try to hire not necessarily for who they are now, but who we think they can become as a part of our team. And that may be a combination of both. I definitely would like to say that we place a lot of emphasis on those soft skills. I mean, we try very hard to get at a lot of those things Brandon was mentioning, a lot of those aspects of how well we can work with this person. You know, what do we judge to be their passion and excitement for the business and the product that we're building? And you can talk about a lot of those things outside the context of just pure raw technical skill. And maybe I'm sort of leaning then towards the soft skill side if we are very excited and see a lot of potential in those areas. So.
Yeah, I think I would tend to sort of lean that way too, right? Because we, like you said, we spend a lot of time focusing on the people that we hire. And I know, especially for me, I want to work with a team of people that, you know, I look forward to seeing every day when I come to work. So a lot of it is whether or not you think you can work with this person every day, because there's no one-man team. Even if you're the best programmer in the world, we're all working together to build this product, right? So it doesn't really matter if you're technically very experienced if we can't work together as a team to accomplish our goals. I mean, that's just how building a company works.
Yeah, and I would say there's a little bit tricky part of this question. I guess I would say if somebody's not a culture fit, then it's an absolute no. Now, by culture fit, which is a strange term that you'll hear a lot, it's really, does this person have the values that we have? And we have 5 core values. They're on our site. It's be open, work together, respect everyone, live our mission, and relentlessly improve. And you know, we want people that are like that. And if somebody is mean, or they can't accept criticism, or you know, get really defensive or other things, there's no way they'll be hired, period. But I do think there's a difference between someone who's maybe a type A, you know, amazing communicator, and somebody who's quiet. I think we're okay with somebody being quiet. It doesn't mean they need to be the most outgoing person in the world. So I guess when thinking of soft skills, there's a difference between this person won't work here because they won't get along with people, and then there's this person's a born communicator, which we wouldn't expect everybody to be. But I think what we're coming back to is that we can get along with people, and as Ross says often, you know, that they can get stuff done, that they're really motivated and want to do it. Whether you're quiet or loud, that's okay, as long as you're in it to win it.
Cool. All right. Thanks, guys. So let's take another question from a different area. So tell us a mistake you've made during your career or job hunting, and how did you recover from that? Or did you?
Interesting. I think one technical mistake that I had made in the past was that we were mostly Ruby on Rails developers, and we wanted to build a mobile application, and we looked for a cross-platform framework that was like essentially using Ruby on Rails to build like a Ruby app. Like it was all like, you know, RESTful Ruby on a smartphone. So we sort of tried to fit like our preconceived like knowledge to the problem, as opposed to learning like the sort of correct way to solve the problem. So I think that was sort of like a, you know, one of the mistakes. Instead of learning how to develop for mobile, we were like, well, we're web developers, so let's just develop like this web app, and then, you know, it'll work on phones without any problems. So that was, you know, that was one of my career mistakes, I'd say, was trying to pick that framework. In terms of job hunting, there was one mistake that I thought I made, which was when I told Brandon that I had never logged into Devpost in our in-person interview. Oh. The look on his face, I was like, oh, there's no coming back from this. But I don't know.
And look, now you're head of engineering.
Yeah.
It can be done.
There's something to be said about blatant honesty, I guess.
Forgot about that, Matt.
I know. I'm going to remind you about it for as long as I'm here.
Well, my number of mistakes are way too many to get into detail. I will say, when it comes to job hunting, I've been very happy with the job choices I've made. I will say the mistake I've made, and I probably will continue to make, you know, as my career progresses, is undervaluing my accomplishments. And I think, and I see this when I interview other developers. I think there's definitely an aspect of the fact that we have sort of the need and the ability to complete these technical tasks, and we're often always trying to improve and get better. And I think we sometimes hold ourselves to a high standard. You know, we might look at other developers that we're aware of in the community, in the field, that are doing great things and think, you know, I'm not good enough, or I don't know that I can do that. And I think there's definitely that trait that I see in others that I speak with, you know, talking about hiring. And I think it's really important for developers to sort of take stock and really appreciate what they have accomplished, what they're capable of, and to be able to communicate that value in the job hunting process is definitely a skill. And I think internalizing those accomplishments and believing in yourself that even though you might not have done this thing or learned this technology or solved this problem, that we're all capable of doing it given the right amount of time, effort, and motivation. So I think that's certainly more of a perspective than, say, an action, but it's certainly something that I see in others, and I know that I've done myself in the job hunting phase, and will continue to try to work on that myself for sure.
Anything to add, Brandon?
I don't think so.
Cool. All right, let's take another question from the audience. What are the key and little-known differences between working as a startup engineer versus an engineer at an established corporation?
Great question, and probably something that a lot of people out there, if they're on the junior side of things, are thinking about. You know, do I take a job at a big company with a lot of people, maybe more people to train me, versus a small company?
Yeah, I mean, I've never worked at an established corporation. All my jobs have been at small startups, so I don't think I really have very good insight into what it's like to work at a big corporate established company.
Yeah, I mean, I can speak mostly from my own experience, and so I will maybe perhaps make some generalizations that won't necessarily apply to all cases. But you know, when you're talking about a startup, you're usually going to be wearing many hats. As a developer at Devpost, I don't just write code. I also help, you know, coordinate with the product development team. I help decide what our process is. My voice in the direction of the company is valued, and it's something that I have an ability to impact. I'm very close to you know, the metal, so to speak. So the aspects of deployment and architecture, these are all things that I have the ability to influence as a member of the team. So it's very hard to define that role. I think what you might often see at a larger company is more boundaries around what your role can be made of. So you might be more likely to see differentiation in terms of like front-end developer, back-end developer, certain types of specialists. That being said, a larger company as a collective group is potentially capable of doing amazing things that, you know, very, you know, small number of people to start up can't. So there's much more focus and much more ability to solve maybe a smaller problem more quickly at a startup, whereas you know, a larger enterprise setup, you might be part of some amazing contributions, like, you know, building, you know, adding to Google's search engine or Gmail or something. These are very ambitious projects that you know, hundreds, potentially thousands of people are participating in. So there's certainly an aspect there that might be slightly different. And then, no, I'd say, you know, perhaps the culture also, and how the company interacts is potentially much different at a startup. So I think it's much more like, in my experience, much more like a family when you work at a startup. And you know, when you work at a larger company, you know, perhaps feeling more like there's more structure and there's more departments and there's more roles, and so I think perhaps feeling more like you're a smaller fish in that big pond. So that also means you might not deal with some of the headaches that come with the fact that startups haven't, you know, necessarily figured out all the wrinkles and whatnot. So it's really not that one is better than the other, but more like what is your personal preference for your environment and the types of problems you get to solve on a day-to-day basis. So.
Yeah, and I would add that not all big companies are alike and not all small companies are alike. I mean, for me, I would say the true north for a junior developer or somebody who is taking their first job, whether it's development, whether it's marketing, whether it's sales, whether it's anything, is to optimize for learning. I believe that that is the absolute most important thing, is whatever, in my opinion, the job that one should take is the job they're going to learn the most at, especially at the beginning. That's when you're soaking everything up. You want to be exposed to as much as possible. That'll help you later in your career. It'll help you understand what you're passionate about. And so I think, you know, there may be concerns, culture is another part of it. There may be some concerns about stability. I would say don't worry about stability. The job market for engineers is very strong. If you're working in a startup and they go out of business, you're not going to have trouble finding a job if you performed well. So I wouldn't worry too much about that. But I think Ross's points around culture do matter. It's what you may be at a small company and absolutely have no oversight and be totally left alone because there's only 3 or 4 engineers and they're going to ignore you. You could be at a big company and they could have an incredible training program where they're putting you through all different parts of technology and really helping you. So ultimately, I would say optimize for learning, but ask hard questions about the culture and about the learning. Don't just take a job because it's some big company. Like, literally ask them. I'll take this time to sort of talk about our team pages. If you go to devpost.com, you click on team pages, this is what these are all about. They're about trying to give you insight into what it's actually like to work at a company. What's the culture like? Who are the people? Are you going to have an impact? Is your code going to see the light of day? And these are the types of things that I don't think anybody has insight into, and we're trying to do with our product as well.
Cool. All right, let's take some more questions. So, could you share your opinions on remote engineering positions versus on-site?
I mean, I think a lot of it is going to be sort of company dependent, just sort of like the conversation we just had about, you know, every company is going to have a different culture. I think there's a lot of companies that do remote engineering very well. I think Stack Overflow or Stack Exchange, whatever they're named now, is very well known for their remote, you know, environment, and they thrive for that type of company. I know here we tend to have engineers in office, and you know that's the way that's been, and that's the way that, you know, we like it for now. But yeah, so I think that's sort of like something that you can't really answer with, you know, one way or another. I think it's going to be very dependent on how the company is set up, whether or not they are sort of inclusive and they remember to sort of, you know, like have team-wide meetings, even though people are in different time zones or things like that. You know, and that's all very company dependent.
I think coming back to the optimize for learning question, I would discourage junior developers, which is really what the topic is here, taking a remote job as your first job. The companies that I know that perform well remotely often don't really hire junior developers as much because there's just so much to teach them, and I know there are cases where that doesn't happen. But again, when you're optimizing for learning, you know, if you got to worry about communicating and you're not seeing body language and you're feeling isolated, you can't go up to somebody, I would imagine it's pretty tough to do all that learning you need to do.
I would tend to agree with that. I think maybe one other aspect to consider is that some companies are part remote and some companies are all remote or mostly all remote. And I would say the latter are much more successful in working remotely and productively. I tend to feel that companies in general that just have some remote employees that don't tend to have their processes and their ways of communicating optimized for those remote folks. So especially for juniors and in general, for most team members who are remote and a mostly on-site team, it's much more of an uphill battle to be as so on equal footing, so to speak, on sort of the day-to-day. So if you're considering remote, I would definitely really think hard and really ask these companies, what is their remote culture like, and you know, how are they set up to work with remote employees effectively? And yet again, as a junior developer who worked on site with talented senior engineers in my past, I wouldn't consider doing it any other way if I were to do it again. So to Brandon's point, I would definitely recommend co-locating for your first tech job.
Cool. All right. So next up, what experiences, technical and non-technical, did you have in the past that helped you most on the job today? So what experiences do you wish you had more? You would have had more. Sorry, I'm having trouble reading today.
Who wants to go first?
Still thinking about it.
I mean,
Yeah, go ahead.
all right. Well, I was just going to jump in and say, I think I just sort of finished on this point, but if I were to look back at my experience coming into the field, having worked at a company that was set up to do pair programming as a regular day-to-day activity was by far the most valuable thing that I had in my learning experience, because I was either driving and had somebody giving me opinions on where the code should go, or I was doing my best to follow along as someone else was driving and keep up with them and see the kinds of decisions that those people made, more experienced engineers. So by far, if I were to do this experience over, I would definitely start with that kind of thing. Either a company set up to do pair programming, or a consultancy that sort of makes that part of their day-to-day experience as a regular thing was a great experience that I would definitely encourage developers to consider.
I mean, this is probably going to sound like a pretty cliched answer, but I think the experiences that have taught me the most are definitely by far the failures, like the project that I mentioned before in terms of trying to develop for mobile using some sort of like web Ruby on Rails sort of clone for mobile. But like the projects, like I feel like if you don't feel like you're failing and learning new things, like you're probably not learning anything at your job, right? Like if you're just coming in and you're just scaffolding some Rails controllers and things aren't like hard and things aren't going wrong, then like that's when you need to find a new company where you can sort of make mistakes and learn things, right? Because other people can tell you your mistakes, but until you make them on your own, you sort of don't value it as much, right? Like you don't understand why things go wrong until you actually do it yourself, and then you're like, all right, I see what they were saying now. That's definitely a thing I want to remember in the future. So not that I want to fail every day, but having the experience of doing something wrong, I think, is really like one of the best experiences.
I think that's a good thing for senior developers to keep in mind, especially when mentoring juniors, is to give that space within the constraints of what the company is trying to accomplish, to give that space for junior developers to potentially forge their own way and course correct as they learn maybe perhaps the pros and cons of making certain decisions. Rather than just saying, this is how you do it, this is how it's done, blah, blah, blah. I think it's much more of a meaningful learning experience when given some adequate room to make mistakes.
Sure. Right. Especially during like pair programming, when you can see the other person going sort of like what you consider to be the wrong way. It's trying to like, in a way, sometimes it can be frustrating, right? Because you're like, you think you know the right solution and you see this person and you're like, oh, this isn't going to work in the end, right? But sometimes you sort of need to step back and let that person learn and sort of like let them see, where they go. Obviously, you have deadlines and you can't let them go too far down sort of the rabbit hole, as we call it. But, it's hard to pull yourself back and let that other person sort of make the same mistakes, because you've made them before, and like you sort of want to protect the person, right? But you're not really protecting them if you're sort of just imposing your views on them.
It's interesting how many times that sort of interaction happens, and then the senior is then surprised to see maybe a new way of doing something that they wouldn't have otherwise considered. So often that's a way that a junior can teach a senior something new, simply by having a fresh perspective and on a problem maybe that other person has already solved before.
Cool. All right. So I think here's one that's a little different. What do you expect a new hire to achieve, or how do you set goals for new hires for their first week, month, or year?
I think this is sort of different whether or not you're hiring a junior engineer versus a senior engineer. But definitely within the first week, we want to be committing to production, actually getting trailer cars across the board for sure. In terms of first month, that's when you should be sort of familiarized with the code base, and you're done sort of with these 1-point trailer cards that are like, change one word on this page. That's sort of like the beginner, familiarize yourself with the code base, figure out where models and things are. So I think by the end of the first month, that's when you sort of want to be working on actual like features or improvements, or like more like real tasks, if you will, like taking off the training wheels. And then within a year, I think sort of having some sort of ownership, like understanding one part of the code base really well, and sort of like maybe being the go-to person for that area. Like people sort of recognize you as like an expert in this sort of area. I think even as a junior developer, that's something that you can sort of accomplish, right? Like getting your own sort of product track or getting your own feature, like I know when I first started here, my biggest project was the new submission flow, right? So that's like, that took a couple months, but after that, I became like the go-to guy when it comes to submissions, right? So sort of showing that you can sort of take ownership of a section and foster it over, multiple months, as opposed to these sort of one-off features.
I think this is going to differ, across organizations, types of companies, startups, enterprise, sort of where you are at coming in. What is your background experience, and sort of where do you expect to grow? But I would say maybe a general thing I expect out of anyone coming into the team, but especially junior developers, to get to a point where anyone on the team can trust that person to take a given task and run with it. So for some people that might be a couple weeks, for some people that might be several months or close to a year. So it's going to vary depending on the person, and in a fast-paced environment like Devpost, we certainly need everyone on the team to get up to speed as quickly as possible. But imagine what it would take for you to earn the trust of other team members to be able to have that, every day you're coming in with a willingness to learn and a willingness to speak your mind, but also to be able to tackle tasks, or at least have the willingness to say, well, I might not know how to do this now, but I really want to learn, and to not shy away from some of those tasks that maybe not everyone likes to do. I think that there's certainly a share of the tedious types of tasks that just need to get done. And so I sort of expect that a junior developer will come in and want to be in a position in a short amount of time to be able to basically take any type of development task and do it independently. But that sometimes takes time to get to that point.
And as CEO, while the junior developers aren't reporting directly to me, I do have a monthly one-on-one with every employee here. What I want to be hearing from the heads of engineering about the new hire, about him or her, is that they're a sponge, that they are trying to learn everything they can, that they're working hard, and while of course they're learning and don't know stuff, that they're really showing effort and drive, that they care, that they're in it to win it. And again, it kind of comes back to less about this technical stuff, which anybody that really wants to badly enough is going to learn what they need to learn technically, but it's those other skills. That's what I want to be hearing from these junior candidates throughout their first year. Are they in it to win it? Are they motivated? Are they a sponge? Are they taking feedback really well? That's what makes a great junior developer from my standpoint.
Cool. All right. Let's talk about imposter syndrome. Tell me about your experiences with it. How did you overcome it? Go.
I don't know if you ever truly overcome imposter syndrome, right? I think it's something that, like Ross said, it's very common to sort of undervalue sort of your contributions to a project. And I think that's sort of like the underlying basis for this imposter syndrome. I know personally that I experienced it because my first job, I got into a startup at a very early phase, and then sort of as the team grew, I moved into more and more senior positions and having more responsibilities. And I think that was sort of like a rare situation because in the back of your head, you're always like, was I just in the right time at the right place, or am I actually like a senior person? Especially when you move up quickly over just a couple of years, you sort of start asking yourself, whether or not you sort of you're in the right place. And I think one of the things that really helps is sort of encouraging other people and realizing, like, sort of appreciating what they're doing and helping them, like Ross said, value and really understand how good they are. So if you can help sort of bolster another person's confidence and sort of when they do something that goes above and beyond, really sort of point that out to them so they hear from someone else other than themselves.
Yeah, I think it's true. I think to some extent we all deal with this. And when we say imposter syndrome, the way I understand it to mean is we have a difficulty internalizing our accomplishments such that we don't think we're as good as perhaps potentially we are in a given skill. And no one's ever figured out programming, right? We're all trying to learn something, and typically that means we're comparing ourselves to someone who's better at us than something, someone who's accomplished something that we aspire to. So in some sense, if we're always trying to get better, we're always reaching to that next point in our growth where we're never quite, at that point where we've figured it out, right? So there's always this feeling of we're not quite there, right? So I think for most of us that are motivated to get better, that's going to be true regardless of how far along you are in your career. So, for me personally, I'm trying things that scare me. So right now, I'm going to be giving my first conference talk in a few weeks. So that scares me to death, but I know that I can get through it. I know that I'm still going to have my health and everything once it's over. So I think just trying to remind myself that, I'm going to be better because of this. And even if I don't do as good a job as I would like to, I will have then something to build off of the next time I go do that thing. So my main suggestion is to continue to try to do those things that scare you. And that might mean getting out of your comfort zone. And that means you're growing, you're learning, and potentially failing. But from those experiences, you can grow much more. So I would say it's if it makes anyone feel any better, it's something that we all experience to some degree. I think it's just something you have to deal with and trust yourself that you can overcome these challenges.
Yeah, I've always found imposter syndrome to be confusing because there's nothing about engineers that makes them really different from other disciplines as people. We all have the same emotions. So why is it that we hear about imposter syndrome specifically with engineers or developers and not so much in other fields, even though everybody is pretty similar? And I think part of it is that is that online, the internet, in terms of information dissemination. So as an engineer, you can create something overnight or in a weekend, and you can share a distinct body of work, and then that spreads really quickly. And so it's sort of easy, I think, as an engineer to be seeing these amazing things get built by other people distinctly, and to say, wow, I'm not good enough. But so maybe accomplishments are sort of more easily shared by engineers with the rest of us. Whereas if you're in marketing or sales, what are you going to share? Notes from this great call that you just did, or 6 months you spent triangulating. Again, I think my point being that really it comes back to all this other stuff we're saying that has less to do just technically with being able to build something yourself and more about these other skills. Are you in it to win it? Are you a hard worker? Do you want to learn? Are you great at taking feedback? Do you make your company better? Do you think strategically? These are not the types of things you necessarily share online and learn about and say, wow, I'm not as good as that person. I'm less interested in that. I want to know about these other skills.
I do wonder if some of it comes from the sort of like culture / community, right? Like, because there's a lot of like big name developers, like like DHH. He made Rails. And he successfully runs 37 signals and things like that. So there's sort of like celebrity status developers in a way. So I think that's one thing that sort of contributes to it, is seeing these people that seemingly achieve so much more than you. Like, I think that's one aspect. And then I think this has sort of hopefully been dying out, is when you see like, you go to job listings and you see like looking for Rockstar Ninja HTML18 programmer, and you're like, am I a Rockstar Ninja? I don't know, right? Like, I think that culture, I think is harmful in a way. It's my perspective.
Agreed. True. All right. Cool. Okay, so let's Brandon, you mentioned that relentlessly improving is one of our sort of core values. What are you guys doing, reading, thinking about in order to improve relentlessly yourselves?
So I guess I'll start because Ross had mentioned the senior software engineer, I forget the exact title, book that he recommended. So I read that. I'm also reading Leading Snowflakes, which Ross also recommended in terms of, Ross is my reading list right now. But that's been a very interesting book to read as well. So obviously reading, I think that would be number one. I started looking into conferences because I used to go to conferences for programming, but now I'm looking for conferences in terms of like leading engineers. So Lead Dev in London, I'm looking at that right now, looking at the schedule, seeing who will be there. I also just signed up for Lighthouse, which is a book about, this is supposed to be about programming, I guess, but in terms of like, managing people. So I've been looking at Lighthouse because that's supposed to help with, one-on-ones and things like that. I guess I got sidetracked, but reading and going to conferences are very good for learning anything, I think.
Yeah, I would say in addition to those resources, there's lots of blogs out there that I could recommend that would certainly could list those later. I think Another good thing I feel that has been important for me to learn some of the concepts even better is to speak about them. So speaking at meetups is something that I've prioritized over the last year, and really any one of these meetups in these tech communities are dying for people to come speak. So it doesn't matter how long you've been programming. I think what you often find in preparing for a talk is that you need to learn the material even that much better. So writing code with some concept in mind, and then being able to speak about it, or potentially two different levels of understanding. So I think that's one way to motivate yourself to potentially go deeper. And another thing I would recommend reading is source code. I think it's very easy for us to get on Stack Overflow and just figure out how to solve some problem quickly and copy and paste some snippets, or just use an API and just use the surface of that library to get our work done. But when we go one level deeper, and because of all the source code available on GitHub, there are literally reams of content to explore how other people solve certain problems. I think it would really benefit folks to take advantage of that curiosity and not be satisfied with saying, all right, I just need to get my job done. But if I really want to understand how this code is working, I need to get down in the source code and follow the path and understand why the developer potentially made the choices that they made. And I find that I then incorporate some of those techniques into my daily work that has made me a better programmer over time.
I think a lot of what Ross is getting at comes back to the idea that teaching others is, considered the best way to learn, right? So it doesn't even necessarily need to be, speaking at meetups. You could have a brown bag session with your colleagues, especially if you're not particularly fond of public speaking at first, like doing it with your peers that and you sit along, and, like Ross says, we're all sort of family here. So starting with your peers and doing sort of like a brown bag, we call them knowledge drops. Dropping knowledge. So doing that is a good way to sort of teach others when you're not, when you don't want to get up in front of 60 people at a meetup. So that's one way to start. And it doesn't need to be speaking either, right? Like there's plenty of organizations within the city that are targeted towards teaching others to code. I know I recently started volunteering at Script Ed, and when you're teaching others to program, that like these are high school students, right? So they have most of them have no background whatsoever, right? So you'll get questions that's like, what is a title tag? Why am I using a title tag, right? So you get questions that you've never thought about, right? Like every time you make a website, you just input a title tag, and you put the title in there, and you don't think about it, right? So it forces you to sort of think about the things that you take for granted. Like you never think about how to describe that to someone. That's just the title tag. You just put a title in it. Like you don't think of good ways to describe these things that you do every day until someone asks you about it.
You're going to give a talk on title tags.
I think the answer is SEO for pretty much any question.
Sure. But what's SEO, right? That's another thing that people don't know.
Juice.
I read a lot too, blogs, business books, biographies, a lot of nonfiction, but I also recommend that everybody read this book called The Lean Startup, which is about continual improvement and about hypothesis-driven product development. It's by Eric Ries. It's really changed the world of startups. And in sort of everybody's quest to build a product that people love, it gives you sort of methodical steps that you can do to try and get there.
Cool. All right, we got time for 2 more questions. So let's jump right into them. So first up, could you elaborate on typical mistakes made by junior developers and your suggestions about how to maybe avoid them?
I'll start with this because there's one that I know that I made when I first started out that I heard over and over again until it finally clicked. And it was mentioned earlier, is going down the rabbit hole, sort of over-engineering your solution and trying to build the most flexible, like cleanest code that you can write. Like we all want clean code that's maintainable that we can work with on a day-to-day, but there's a point where you have to step back and think about the business and think like, how much time how much value does refactoring this again and again provide to the company, right? Like there's a constant trade-off between building the best, most maintainable code versus getting product out the door and adding values to users. And I know when I first started out, I was just so excited about writing code. I would over-engineer things all the time, and I would overthink things and not just sort of go down rabbit holes. And you start researching one topic, and then you move on to another topic, and you just sort of keep trying to learn more and more, right? As opposed to actually delivering the value to your users. So And from sending out code exercises to juniors, I think that's one thing that you see the people that take things like the simplest approach, like they just write like line by line Ruby scripts, and then you see other people that build they take input and they build classes and things like that. So seeing like the spectrums of solutions that people provide, you see sort of whether or not people or how people think about the trade-offs that they make.
Well, I would say there's a lot of mistakes that I made as a junior developer and continue to make, or potentially make other mistakes as a more seasoned engineer. But maybe I'll illustrate one mistake that I made commonly with a story. Now, keep in mind that I did not learn to code through a code school, so a lot of the concepts that I maybe expect folks coming out of boot camps to have been exposed to, I did not have that formal supportive community environment. So I was sort of learning a lot of concepts sort of by mistake as I would encounter them in my day-to-day work in my first job as an engineer. So I remember in one of my first few months, we were having a stand-up and developers were speaking about a problem that they encountered, and one of them was using the term callback. I had never heard the term callback before, and so as this developer was talking about the difficulties he was having with this callback, I kept thinking in my head, well, what does he need a phone for? I don't quite understand what he means. Like this was not a term that I had sort of previous experience with, so I was not necessarily understanding the thrust of the conversation. And I was afraid to ask what it was. And I think that's potentially something that many of us are prideful and don't want to reveal that we don't know something. And I think that potentially held me back early on in my career. So I would definitely encourage people to ask questions when they encounter things that they don't understand. And it may not necessarily be as low level as just like, what is this thing? And it could be maybe more advanced, but potentially we hold ourselves back if we aren't willing to ask questions and get help from other folks on the team, and would certainly encourage junior developers to speak up.
Like one mistake junior developers make is perhaps taking the wrong job, one that isn't optimizing for learning, to come back to an earlier part of the AMA. So really it's about optimizing for learning and not getting caught up in competition with other people in your class about, who got the biggest bonus or the whatever. Honestly, you'll be investing much more in yourself if you take a job in a place where you feel real confident you're going to be learning a ton.
I think it's funny that you bring up not asking enough questions, right? Because there's it's a really hard balance to find, right? Because you'll find blog articles, like I read one recently that was like, I doubled my salary at Google because I stopped asking questions, right? Like it's a very fine line between asking no questions and asking so many questions that you don't learn how to help yourself. Mm-hmm. It's a very fine line, I think.
I thought you guys were going to say tabs versus spaces or something. That's what I was hoping for. All right, cool. So on to our last question, which is, knowing what you know now, what would you say to yourself or any student going into their last year of engineering school?
This is specifically to my experience, is that I know when I first started working right out of college, I realized very quickly that I didn't have the application skills that I was hoping for. I spent a lot of time learning about theory and algorithms and big O notations and things like that, and I didn't have enough sort of experience in terms of actually like building web applications or writing real world programs. So definitely like the internships where you'll get that experience, I think are very important, because you need to be in between the middle of those, right? If you want to be a web developer, you can't have all theory and no experience, because then you don't know how to apply things, and you can't be so far to the other extreme that you have like very practical application, but you don't learn how to think like a programmer, right? So you really need to balance those two things out, I think.
I would say simply have fun. You're going to have, hopefully, a long, illustrious, and fruitful career of working hard. And as I expect students to be working hard as well, that potentially, have opportunity to enjoy themselves even more so than when you become an adult with many, responsibilities that not necessarily are all at work. So definitely take the opportunity to enjoy yourself.
And I would say go to devpost.com/teams and check out the team pages of the companies that are up there, because you're probably looking for a job, and then fill out your portfolio, make it look great. And that's my advice.
All right. Well, folks, thanks so much for joining us and for your questions. And you guys, thanks so much for opening up about your own experiences.
Thank you, Neil.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks everybody for the questions.
All right. That's it for this week.